Thank you so much, David. Or am I on? All right, great. Thank you so much for the super kind introduction. It's an incredible pleasure to be back here. I was here with Maria and with David 5 years ago in February of 2020, talking to you about research about the intersection of social and digital media and politics. And since they invited me back, I figure that's exactly what they want me to talk about again here today. But I'm going to talk to you today about a project that I started immediately upon leaving the Camden Conference last year, also in February of 2020, which David mentioned is the US 2020 Facebook and Instagram election study. So quickly, what I'm going to do in the talk today, I'm going to first talk about the sort of unique nature of this, which involved collaborating between external academics and a team of researchers at Meta. Then I'm going to do a brief introduction into what is polarization, because today I'm going to talk about what we learned from that study about social media and polarization. So I want to define what polarization means. Then I'll walk you through the research design, results, and then I'll conclude with what we've learned both about the science, but also about the possibility of doing this kind of industry academia collaborative research. So first off, working with Meta. This was a project, as I mentioned, it started right after I left Camden in 2020. As you remember, something else happened right after we left Camden in 2020 then. And I had the incredible honor to be chosen as one of the two co-academic leads, along with my amazing co-lead, Professor Talia Stroud of the University of Texas, Austin. We put together a team of 17 academics that would then go on to collaborate on this study with a team of internal researchers at Meta. This is what ChatGPT thinks academics collaborating with people at Meta looks like. So the way that this worked is that Meta set the contours of the study. We were invited to design research, and the context was we were going to try to understand the impact of Facebook and Instagram in the context of the US 2020 elections. Now, you might recall from when we were at Camden 5 years ago, and I was presenting a lot of research about the 2016 US elections, we walked out of the 2016 US elections, out of Brexit, out of other things that we've talked about here so far, with lots of questions, but not many answers about how social media had impacted those outcomes. So the goal here was to learn more about 2020, going into 2020. So for this first step, the academic team that Talia and I put together, we identified 4 key areas of research. The effects, and these were all based on big topics in science, but also big topics in the popular questions that people had about social media's impact. And the 4 topics that we decided to focus this on were social media's impact on political polarization, on information, misinformation, true information, circulation of information during the election, on people's participation in politics, and then finally, a little bit too prophetically, we wanted to look at people's trust in institutions, but also in belief in legitimacy of the elections. There's way too much there to go into in 20 minutes. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the findings we've learned from some of the original papers that have been published on polarization. After we identified these key areas, we then got together as teams and worked on coming up with specific topics for specific academic research papers. This was ultimately a scientific endeavor. We assembled different teams to work on different papers, and we were off to the races. The first thing I want to note is that this involved a tremendous amount of work. This really took a village. There are tons of people who were involved with this project to pull all of this off, and we're still working on it now today. But the other thing I want to point out is, yes, we were working with researchers at the very company whose impact we were trying to study. So we thought, I don't have time to go into this. I'm happy to talk more about it at Q&A, talk one-on-one with people about it later on in the conference. But I just want to be clear, we were super cognizant of this. And we were learning from previous studies that had done. I read about collaborations with pharmaceutical companies and researchers. We did a lot. We consciously thought about this, put lots and lots of things into place, some of which are very technical, about like pre-registering our studies so that we couldn't cherry pick results afterwards. We said beforehand what we would report. Some of it are more obvious. We didn't take any money to participate in this study, but I'm happy to talk more about it. But I just want to be clear, we thought a ton about this. I'm super excited that in the summer of 2023, the first 4 papers were published simultaneously on the same day in Science and Nature. We even had the cover of Science magazine. They all came out in July of 2023. A 5th paper, which I'm also going to talk about, came out a little bit later in January of 2024 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Today, I'm going to talk to you about results from those 5 papers. We've had a 6th paper published. We've got 2 more coming out soon. We've got 3 more under review. We've got 4 more coming. There's still a lot of research to come from this. All right, so very quickly, I'm going to talk to you about Facebook and Instagram and political polarization. So I'm an academic, I'm a teacher, I want to define my term of polarization. David did a great job this morning talking about defining democracy. Polarization is a word that's used in the common vernacular. And to be super clear about this, I usually spend about an entire lecture on this in my social media and politics undergraduate course. But I'm going to give you one slide here, okay? So when we talk about polarization, we think about it as a high level about divisions in society. There can be political polarization, there can be ethnic polarization, there can be lots of different types of polarization. When political scientists traditionally have talked about the levels of political polarization in political systems, we've referred to what I call here issue polarization or policy polarization. This is if you think very, and I liked in the previous talk talking about two dimensions of politics or one dimension of politics. If we collapse politics into a single left-right dimension, which we often do when we're trying to theorize about it in the abstract, you can think about where the left-wing party is positioned and where the right-wing party is positioned. And if they're positioned kind of close to each other, left of center, right of center, we'd say that's a less polarized system than one when those two parties are positioned far to the left and the right. But what we're talking about here, no matter how we talk about this, and we do this comparatively, we look across different countries, different periods of time, we talk about more and less polarization, it's about those policy positions, right? The simplest one is what should be the marginal rate of tax on income, right? But you can think about any policy that you put out there. That's traditionally what we meant by polarization. But in the last 15 years, we've been talking a lot more about something called affective polarization. And affective polarization, simply put, is how much people dislike the supporters of the other political party, or how much they dislike the politicians of the other party. The classic sort of statement about this is if you go back, picking up on David, you go back to like the 1960s, you ask people, people were, fairly uncomfortable with their child marrying someone of a different race, but they didn't really concerned about people marrying someone from a different political party. You flip to the 2020s, it's the opposite. Most people are much more comfortable with their kid marrying someone of a different race. A lot of people will express hostility to their child marrying someone from a different political party. That's affective polarization. The bottom line is affective polarization has been on the rise in the United States over the last decades. And we have a different piece in Science, which I can share with anyone who's interested that's got data on this, but there's lots and lots of data on this. So what I'm going to talk about today is Facebook and Instagram's impact on these polarizations. This is what I mean by it. All right, so let me talk about the research design that we were able to do here. In this big study, we used two different types of research designs. One is what's known as observational research design. With an observational research design, you are literally just looking at data that's out there in the actual world. What we were able to do in the course of this study, because we were working with Meta, is we got data on every adult monthly user of Facebook and Instagram in the United States over the course of the 2020 election campaign. Now, we didn't have individual level data. We had this data aggregated up to protect people's privacy and also because it's huge, but we're talking about 200 million people. Those are the observational studies. I'm going to show you some results from them. We also were able to run experimental studies. The reason that social scientists do experimental studies is that we want to get at causality. We want to see if something causes something. And in an experimental study, what you do is you randomly assign your subjects to what's known as a treatment group and a control group. And if your randomization works, there should be nothing different between those two bunches of people. You then do something different to the treatment group, and if there's some outcome, in our case, attitudes about polarization, that's different, you can ascribe it to the treatment. This is how we test drugs, how we test vaccines. This was long been prevalent in natural sciences, medical sciences. We do this more and more in social science. What made this study incredible was that because we were working with Meta, we were actually able to randomize people. The treatment that we randomized into was a different experience on the platform. By the way, talked about learning from prior studies. This was all done with consenting participants who agreed to participate in the study and who were compensated for their time in participating in the study as well. So I'm going to show you results from both of these different types of studies. And again, this goes back to, if you ask, why would you work with Meta, right, to study Meta? Well, these studies would have been impossible without working with Meta. The alternative to it is it's just Meta doing it without working with external academics, and then you get none of the integrity provisions that we have before. All right, so this is what we're able to do. I'm going to show you results from this about polarization. Let me talk first about the observational studies. So these are not studies where we're running any manipulations. I'm just going to tell you about things that were happening on the platform. 2 of those first 5 papers had large observational studies that were components of it. The first looked at ideological segregation in exposure to news about politics on the platform. And what we were able to do was, I'm going to show you some results in 1 second, we're able to measure the segregation of the audiences of news links. And what I mean by that is, we could say for any given news story, was it equally seen by Democrats and Republicans or liberals and conservatives? If so, that would have a segregation index of 0. If it was only seen by liberals or conservatives, it would have a segregation index of 1. So I'm going to show you some data about that in a second. The other thing is, because we know the audience of these stories, we can tell you were the stories seen primarily by liberals or were the stories seen primarily by conservatives. And so we wanted to understand how segregated the news environment was. In the second study, which we called Like-Minded, we were able to see how much of people's Facebook feeds or Instagram feeds that they saw, how much of that content came from people who were politically similar to them. Now, I want to be really clear. In this study, the unit of analysis, what we're looking at is news stories. In this study, what we're looking at is content, is the source of the content. We're not ranking whether anything that I post on Facebook is liberal or conservative. We're just looking at when I see something, is it primarily coming from liberals or is it primarily coming from conservatives? And then we're going to be able to see how much of people's exposure is from ideologically like-minded sources. All right. So first, let me show you the observational, the ideological segregation and the exposure to news. I told you before about those numbers. By comparison, studies of web browsing, when people were left to their own design, had about a 0.10 level of ideological segregation. What we found on Facebook, when we looked at the domain level, it was about a 0.35 level of ideological segregation. When we looked at the actual URL, it was about a 0.50 level. Those of you who remember me here from 5 years ago know that I was sort of pushing back on some of the echo chamber stuff from earlier research we had done on Twitter. This actually made me update my own views about that there was more ideological segregation than I thought there had been on Facebook from having seen this. The second big finding we got from this study is that there is some asymmetry in this segregation. And in particular, we see on the right side, we see on the right side of these figures, which is the conservative side, and the left side is the liberal side, we see there's lots of stuff that's just seen by liberals and conservatives, but there's more stuff that's just seen by conservatives. So there is a segment in 2020, there was a segment of the Facebook news ecosystem in the United States that was almost entirely only seen by conservatives. And it wasn't quite symmetrical in this case, nor was it uniformly distributed. What about the other study? How much came from like-minded sources? If I'm a conservative, how much of what I see is also from other conservatives? If I'm liberal, how much of what I see is also from other liberals? Well, it turns out that the median Facebook user, the average Facebook user, about 50% of their content comes from politically like-minded sources, and only 15% of their content comes from cross-cutting sources. The other 35% comes from moderates. However, so the majority of your content you get is from politically like-minded sources, and it's about 3 times as much as you get from cross-cutting. However, remember, we were just looking at the sources, not the content. Political information in news is actually a tiny fraction of that content, about less than 7% for both of them. Also, extreme echo chambers are pretty rare. So only 20% of people got at least 75% of their content from politically like-minded sources. At the same respect, exposure to a lot of cross-cutting content is also pretty rare. Only 1/3 of people got at least 25% of their content from cross-cutting sources. All right, so that's the observational things. What am I going to show you from the experimental research? For our experimental research, we tried to dive into the big topics that we were talking about here at Camden 5 years ago. Remember, I went straight from Camden to trying to design this study afterwards. What were we talking about? We were talking, what was the public talking about? What was the scientific community interested in? What's the effect of the algorithm? We heard about this yesterday from Maria. So in one study, what we did is our control group got what everybody else was getting on Facebook, the algorithm that was delivering content to everybody on Facebook during the 2020 election. Our treatment group got the old style social media, reverse chronological feed, the most recent post by a friend or someone you had chosen to follow. Another thing we hear about social media, virality, the speed at which things spread across social media. And so for another experiment, the treatment group didn't see any reshared content. Filter bubbles, echo chambers. We've been talking about that a lot already again here today. So we wanted to try to break people out of these echo chambers. And so in a third experiment, we reduced the amount of content that people saw from these like-minded sources. And then finally, the fourth study was, is it social media's fault altogether, right? We took people off of social media entirely for 6 weeks over the course of the campaign. Political polarization is what I'm talking to you about today. There's lots of other things in these papers about lots of other topics. I don't know what your expectations were. I have a sense of what my expectations were. We didn't find any impact in any of these studies for any of these things on political polarization. And this is why you have to do the research. These were huge studies. There were 20,000 people in them. This allows us to what we do call precisely estimate null effects. We are very confident in these not having any effects. I'm going to show you super quickly, I'm going to show you results. I'm going to put some figures up here. Don't worry if you're not used to them. But this is from our algorithm one. Basically where this line is a null effect going up. And then those little dots are our best estimates. And the spread is how uncertain we are. There's no effect here. This is a table. In our virality, we show no effect. Like-minded sources, I mean, these are right on the zero line. This is the full deactivation. Here we saw, for the full deactivation, we saw a hint of something with affective polarization going down, although issue polarization seemed to go up. But it's a tiny effect, and it's not what we call statistically significant. It doesn't survive statistical challenges. And so across all of these, and again, we pre-registered every test we were going to do and how we were going to report the results. We found no impact. All right, so what can and can't we conclude about Facebook, Instagram, and political polarization? First off, I want to be super clear. We designed a study to understand what was happening in the context of the US 2020 election, because in the context of the US 2016 election, we didn't have answers. So we have to be very careful about what we generalize from. This is a study. The way science progresses is to have lots of studies testing things over and over again. This was only 3-month treatments. It was only in one country, the United States. It was during an election campaign when we know Meta was doing lots of different things on their platform, although I want to be clear that was a feature of the study, not a bug. The idea was to understand what happened during an election. We only used consenting participants in our experimental studies. We only altered one aspect of the platform experience for them. It's possible if we had done algorithm and virality and echo chambers, we would have gotten different results. And of course, we only looked at what was going on one platform at a time. So those are the caveats to generalization. What I want to be clear is what we cannot conclude, because there was a lot of discussion about this in the aftermath of when these studies were released in the media. We cannot answer the question that everybody wants to know the answer to. Is political polarization the fault of social media? Because what we did is we made small changes in the course of a world where social media had been around for 15 years already, and in a world where everybody else was on social media, right? So it's the wrong counterfactual for the question that everyone wants to answer. By the way, this is what ChatGPT thinks a world with no one on social media looks like. Okay, so we can't conclude that. So what can we conclude? I think we've learned we can conclude a couple of things here that are quite important. The first thing is that there was a great deal of ideological segregation on Facebook at the time of the 2020 elections. There was a lot of news that was read by liberals and especially by conservatives and not read by the others. In results I didn't show you, this segregation was driven quite a bit by activity of pages and groups, which Maria was talking about yesterday, more so than individual users. But even that being said, most of the content with people that we're seeing on Facebook, and especially on Instagram, had nothing to do with politics and wasn't about politics. That's the first thing we can do. The second thing is a kind of sad realization, but a super important realization, which is that I would have loved to have come here to you today and be able to say, we learned if you just put reverse chronological feed on for 3 months before an election, it will cool the tempers of the country. People will like each other more. We didn't find simple answers for these complex problems. And I think the question that we have to ask is why. And one particular reason might be is this just a reflection of the nature of the information environment in the digital information era? That people are getting so much information from so many different sources that even if we change Facebook, which was the big one in 2020, and by the time we get to 2024, we've got fragmentation into multiple platforms, that doing anything on one platform, one change, just can't affect things. Or, if you remember David's chart about the decline in trust, that doesn't start when social media starts. That goes back decades. Is it the fact, and very in contrast to Europe where people are coming unmoored from their parties, is it the case that in the United States, polarization is such a fixed attitude here now, especially this affective polarization, that it's incredibly hard to change it doing anything? And these are the questions I think we have to really wrestle with, because it's nice to be able to say, well, if we just tinkered with this one thing on this one platform, everything would go back to normal the way it was before. But this was a massive research project that really should cause us to question those kind of simple solutions for complex problems. I know I'm out of time. I'm going to take my extra minute that the guy before me took for his extra minute to just say one thing about what have we learned about this kind of research. And this is what I want to say. This project had first-order goals and second-order goals. First-order goals, we wanted scientific knowledge. We wanted answers to questions that we didn't have in 2016, and we wanted to know more about what happened in 2020. In that case, it's been an unmitigated success. It's taken quite a while, as scientific papers often do. We can argue about what trade-offs in that regard. But we are going to know much more about the 2020 election and its relationship to social media than we knew about 2016 by far. Unfortunately, we're also going to know much more about the 2020 election than we will about the 2024 election. And part of the reason we all put so much work into this is that we hope this would be a model. That we hope by 2024, Facebook would be running another study, but that TikTok would run a study, and that X would run a study. And so far, it's been crickets in anyone picking up this, which is a profound disappointment to me. But what I want to leave you with is my last point. What I have shown you today is that this is possible. People can come, outside researchers can design studies in a way that have scientific integrity enough to be published in the top journals in the world and tell you, the public, what's happening. We can tell you what's happening on the platform. We can test, working with the platforms, key assumptions that the public have about the impacts of these particular platforms. US 2020 was voluntary. It was Meta's idea. They reached out to academics to collaborate with them. But we know it's possible now. And so the question is, what are you, as the public, going to demand from your governments for what we should know about these platforms? We have regulators, banking regulators, inside of banks who stress test banks. Banks are pretty important. So too is the information environment. What if the Philippines government required that there be studies like this in order for Meta to operate in the Philippines? It is not a foreign concept that companies have to submit to regulation so that the public can know their impact on society. So I leave you with that thought today. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure.